This is the bicycle frame video part 7. In previous videos we made a frame master file that contains the front triangle of the bike frame and only the right hand side of the rear triangle. It's missing certain items intentionally, such as fillets on edges, miters of the tubes, you can see the intersection of the tubes here, and any threaded holes that are supposed to be going into the bosses. This master contains a total of 9 bodies representing the various tubes. We created separate part files for each of these bodies by inserting this master file into brand new part files and then deleting what we didn't need. For example, this is the part that will become the down tube. It has inserted into it the master frame file. Appropriate surfaces were offset for mitering. Unneeded bodies were deleted, leaving us just with the body for the down tube and surfaces for mitering the ends of the tube. Then we did all of our miter cuts and deleted the surface bodies that were no longer needed. Finally, in this particular case, we added tapped holes at the bosses and some refining fillets on the sharp edges, leaving us with just the down tube in this file. And this process was repeated for all the other parts. This resulted in a total of 12 separate bicycle frame parts, which we want to assemble into a single assembly file and use that assembly environment to make an exploded frame assembly that can be put into a drawing. Here we see an example of the frame assembly with all the individual frame parts inserted into it, and then by going to our configurations tab and clicking on the default, I have here an exploded view that's been created for this frame. So right-clicking on the exploded view and selecting explode, all the frame components have been exploded away from each other, which is convenient for an assembly drawing. So the purpose of this video is to recombine all these parts into an assembly file and then create the exploded view that you see here. We start this process by going up to File, New, choosing Assembly, OK, and right away it wants to bring you into an environment where you can start putting components into your assembly. Before we do that, we want to make sure that the origin is visible. So we'll go up to View, Origins, and here's our origin. Now we can start working on placing our parts into this assembly. Each part was derived from the master file, and each part has a common origin. So if we simply bring each part into this assembly and have it aligned with the origin, all the parts will come in their proper orientation. There's 2 ways we can do this. If we are using a release of Solidworks that's 2012 or sooner, we can only place one part at a time into this assembly. If we're using 2013 or later, we can place all the parts simultaneously into the assembly. I will show both methods. We have our feature manager open for the assembly. Right now we have no open documents, so I will browse to the folder that has all of my bike parts. What I will do is just simply insert each part at a time in the order that I see in my folder. So I will click on the bottom bracket shell, open, and all I have to do is click the green check mark, and that will snap the origin of the bottom bracket shell to the origin of the assembly. Now I've zoomed out a bit and I've changed the background color to white. I've zoomed out so that I can see the other frame components popping into place as I insert them. Now I just continue the process that I did with the bottom bracket shell. Again, going to Insert Components, Browse. The next item in the list was the brake bridge, open, and I just click on the green check mark. And we see the brake bridge taking its proper position and space. Insert Components, Browse. Next is Chainstay Left, open, green check mark, and we can start seeing how these pieces are coming together. Insert Components, Browse, right chainstay, open, And we just continue this process until we have the entire frame reassembled as we see here. So here we have all 12 components in the assembly, and each one has been placed in a fixed condition with its origin corresponding with the origin of the assembly. But that's a bit tedious, constantly having to hit insert components, grabbing the next one in the list, and then placing it into the assembly. There actually is an easier way to do this if you're using 2013. Simply go to Insert Components, browse again, and this time select all of the items in your folder by holding down the Shift key, clicking the first in the list, and clicking the last. Now there's a few items here I actually don't want in my assembly, so I will now hold the Control key and I'll get rid of this bike geometry file, this welded frame file, and the master frame file. Now I click on Open. It takes a moment for it to populate those into the Open Documents box. Now what I do is move my cursor over the origin of the assembly. And when I do that, you see the cursor changes to a new symbol with the icon for the part and that little double origin icon. And I double click on the assembly origin. You see what happens is it automatically populates the entire assembly with all the parts that I had selected in the folder. How cool is that? I think that took about 5 seconds. Now we are ready to make our exploded configuration. Go to your Configurations tab and we see that we have the default. Before we do that, we should select what orientation we want the view to be in, because that will be the view that we want to show in our drawing. So when we make our explosion, we want it to look good from that particular view that we select. A lot of people like to do an explosion in the isometric orientation, like that. But sometimes I find that view is just a little bit too far above the object, and I sometimes like to make a custom view. What I do is I start looking straight at it from the front plane, and then I use my arrow keys on my keyboard to rotate the view to the way I want it. So I'll maybe click on my left arrow a couple of times this way, and my right arrow once or twice this way. Maybe I'll bring that back down again. I'll go one more time this way and twice this way. Let's compare that to what an isometric view would look like. So that's almost like an isometric view. So I'll bring it back again to the front view, and I'll go 2 steps this way and 1 step that way. And that's going to look good, I think, when I do my exploded view. I can save this now by clicking my space bar and choosing New View, and I will call this view Exploded View, and say OK, and close that. So now if I come to some other orientation, for whatever reason, I can hit my space bar, go down to Exploded View, and I'm back to where I started. Now to make the exploded configuration, we go to our default configuration, right-click, New Exploded View. And that puts us into a new Exploded View Manager. It includes a pane for the exploded steps we are going to create, a box for the parts that are going to be exploded, the distance that they explode, and the direction that they explode. We have a symmetrical frame here, and I like to create the explosion in such a way that symmetrical items look like they are exploding symmetrically. The way I have found that works well is to explode things in groupings, and this demonstration should show the advantages of doing that. We have the front triangle and the rear triangle. The rear triangle consists of mirror images of the right and left sides of the bike. I'm going to work on the rear triangle first. Scrolling down a little bit so that I can see my settings box here, I will select all of the components in the rear triangle, and as I do that, you see those components popping into the settings box. My goal is to explode everything away from the bottom bracket shell. The bottom bracket shell will be the one static thing in this explosion. You also see that when I selected all these items, this multicolored triad came up with the X, Y, and Z axes on it. Now that I've selected these items for the explosion, I'll pick the appropriate arrow to drag the components for the first explosion. I want to go backwards along the x-axis, so I'll grab the X arrow with my left key, holding down and dragging and pulling all of the components together. Now we see that the settings box is empty again, and we exploded about 195 millimeters. I will reselect just the right side. This time I'll grab the blue arrow and drag out this way. And now I'll select the left side and drag the blue arrow this way. You notice that I've left the brake bridge floating in space. So we've just done 3 steps, and if I scroll to the top here, we see those steps appearing in the Explode Steps box. Coming back down again, I want to explode the dropout plates away from the stays. Selecting those dropout plates, I will drag them backwards this way, and then to make them look a little balanced between the seat stay and the chain stay, I will select them once again, and this time drag them down this way so they look like they're somewhat in line with the stays. So you see that I can keep reselecting the same components over and over again and constantly re-explode them. And you see what I've done is started with large groupings and worked my way down to small groupings. Now it's time to explode the front triangle. I'm going to leave the bottom bracket shell and the seat tube in place and just grab the top tube, head tube, and down tube, drag those forward, then reselect the head tube, drag that forward, and finally, to get the separation between the top tube and the down tube, I'll select the top tube and drag that upward. The last item to explode will be the seat tube, and it would be kind of nice to explode it along its own axis. But you've seen whenever I choose components, the triad always gives me just an X, Y, or Z option. I will click on the seat tube. Here we are with our X, Y, and Z option. But this time in the directions box, I will clear this out by highlighting the item in the box, hitting delete, and then selecting the cylindrical surface of this tube. In doing so, that will find a virtual axis through the tube, and it rotates the orientation of the triad along that axis. If I didn't have a cylindrical surface, but I had some other type of an axis or a straight edge, I could click on that as well. Now I can grab the blue arrow and drag in that direction, giving me a nice explosion that goes straight back into the bottom bracket shell. If we scroll back up again, we now see that we've created 9 explosion steps. So it took only 9 steps to explode 11 parts. Remember, we left this one alone. So we actually saved a few steps by exploding things in groupings, and by exploding things in groupings, we naturally created symmetry and alignment between these parts in the rear triangle. Now we can always edit these steps. When I drag these, I was just dragging them an arbitrary amount. Maybe I want to drag them a very specific distance. So I can identify the appropriate explode steps that I want to change just by highlighting them in this box and looking at what happens in the graphics window. Step 1 is exploding all these items. Step 2, the right side triangle. Step 3, the left side. Let's say I first want to adjust the distance of step 1. I click on step 1, right click, edit step, scroll down, and it shows me all the items that were exploded in that step. And we see that the distance exploded was this random amount that I dragged the components. Maybe I really want it to be a specific number, like 225, for example. We see that gives us a nice round number, and these parts have moved to their new position. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I didn't want the brake bridge to be in this explosion step. I can always just reselect the brake bridge, which takes it out of the settings box. If I hit apply, that finishes this edit step, and it puts the brake bridge back in its original position. I could always re-edit this step to add the brake bridge back to it again. I can even change the order of the explode steps just by left-clicking on the step and dragging to the desired position in the explode step list. Here we see step 9 has been moved to the 3rd position. This may or may not change what you end up seeing on the screen depending on how you did your explode. But you might decide that you want your steps to appear in a certain logical order. When you're happy with your explosion, just hit the green check mark, and that completes the exploded view, leaving it still in the exploded state. You can collapse this exploded view simply by right-clicking on Explode View and going to Collapse. Or, if you want to be fancy about it, you can right-click on Explode View and say Animate Collapse, and it will collapse the exploded view in the exact opposite order of the exploded steps. This might be a reason why you would want to alter the order of your steps. When you bring up the Animate Collapse, you have an animation controller that comes up. You can choose whether the collapse occurs in just one direction, is cyclical, or is looping, or reciprocates back and forth between collapsing and exploding, and you can also control the speed. So if I put this on loop and hit play, we see that it collapses, jumps back to explode, and collapses again. If we go to reciprocate, it collapses and then re-explodes and then re-collapses again. My experience has been that clients are often very impressed by shiny toys like this. So if you want to be very impressive in a meeting with a client, just animate this collapse and explosion and you'll look like a genius. Just don't tell them how easy it is to do. So let's stop the animation here and close the controller, which will recollapse the frame. And I'll just point out that when we created this custom exploded view, when we insert this assembly into a new drawing, we will be able to choose this custom exploded view in the new drawing and get the exploded orientation and view that will look just like what we created in the assembly file. This concludes the bike frame video part 7.